Second language acquisition, unit number 3, Intro to English Linguistics with me, Ismael Aristides Merlos Juarez. Welcome to this video, guys. In this time, I'm going to explain to you about the content of the last topic of the branches of applied linguistics. So I hope you liked it and try to pay attention to this explanation. Let's begin. So the objective of this subject was to get acquainted with the functions of the English language through a systematic linguistic analysis by means of individual and collaborative strategies. So what are the learning outcomes for this class? To review what learning a second language is, check the origin of the theories about second language learning, and judge the role of the second language theories in reality. The contents to be developed: number 1, second language acquisition; number 2, history of second language theories and approach; number 3, focus on the learner; number 4, communicative competence. Let's start. How is a second language acquired? A new language. Some children grow up in a social environment where more than one language is used and are able to acquire a second language in circumstances similar to those of first language acquisition. Those fortunate individuals are bilingual. However, most of us are not exposed to a second language until much later, and our ability to use a second language, even after years of study, rarely matches ability in our first language. A distinction is sometimes made between learning in a foreign language setting, learning a language that is not generally spoken in the surrounding community, and a second language setting, learning a language that is spoken in the surrounding community. That is, Japanese students in an English class in Japan are learning English as a foreign language, EFL. And if those same students were in an English class in the USA, they will be learning English as a second language. In either case, they are simply trying to learn another language. So the expression second language learning is used more generally to describe both situations. Acquisition. A more significant distinction is made between acquisition and learning. The term acquisition is used to refer to the gradual development of ability in a language by using it naturally in communicative situations with others who know the language. Learning. The term learning, however, applies to a more conscious process of accumulating knowledge of the features, such as vocabulary and grammar, of a language, typically in an institutional setting. For example, mathematics, is learned, not acquired. What are the acquisition barriers? The age people start the process of learning a new language, the environment where they are learning it, the amount of hours the person is exposed to the language they want to learn, and the interference of their native language. The affective factors. Teenagers are typically more self-conscious than younger children. If there is a strong element of unwillingness or embarrassment in attempting to produce the different sounds of another language, then it may override whatever physical and cognitive abilities there are. If this self-consciousness is accompanied by a lack of empathy with the other culture, for example, feeling no identification with speakers or their customs, then the subtle effects of not really wanting to sound like a Russian or a German or American may strongly inhibit the learning process. Let's focus on the method. Despite all the barriers, there is a great necessity of finding a way to transmit knowledge about a language and make a person able to learn it and master it. Because of that, the research of the best methodology for teaching a second language have been thought and had evolved through a very long period of time. Let's check out some of the most well-known methodologies. Let's start with the grammar translation method. The most traditional approach is to treat L2 learning in the same way as any other academic subject. Vocabulary lists and sets of grammar rules are used to define the target of learning. Memorization is encouraged. The written language rather than spoken language is emphasized. This method had its roots in the traditional teaching of Latin and is described as the grammar translation method. Is it not relevant anymore? This label has actually been applied to the approach by its detractors, who have pointed out that its emphasis on learning about the EL2 often leaves students quite ignorant of how the language might be used in everyday conversation. Although this method clearly produced many successful L2 users over the centuries, it is sometimes claimed that students that have school having achieved high grades in French class via this method yet find themselves at a loss when confronted by the way the French in France actually use their language. Autolingual method. A very different approach emphasizing the spoken language became popular in the middle of the 20th century. It involved a systematic representation of the structures of the L2, moving from the simple to the more complex, in the forms of drills that the student had to repeat. This approach, called the audiolingual method, was strongly influenced by a belief that the fluent use of the language was essentially a set of habits that could be developed with a lot of practice. Much of this practice involved hours spent in a language laboratory repeating oral drills. Versions of this approach are still used in language teaching, but its critics have pointed out that isolated practice in drilling language patterns bear no resemblance to the interactional nature of spoken language use. Communicative approaches. More recent versions of the L2 learning experience can best be described as communicative approaches. They are partially a reaction against the artificially or pattern practice and also against the belief that consciously learning the grammar rules of a language will necessarily result in the ability to use the language. Although there are many different versions on how to create communicative experience for L2 learners, they are all based on a belief the functions of language, what it is for, should be emphasized rather than the forms of the language, correct grammatical or phonological structures. Classroom lessons are likely to be organized around concepts such as asking for things in different social settings rather than forms of the past tense in different sentences. These changes have coincided with attempts to provide more appropriate materials for L2 learning that has a specific purpose, as in English for medical personnel or Japanese for business people. Let's focus on the learner. An error, then, is not something that hinders a student progress, but is probably a clue to the active learning process being made by the student as he or she tries out ways of communicating in a new language. Just as children acquiring their L1 produce certain types of ungrammatical forms at times, so we might expect the L2 learner to produce similar forms at certain stages. Transfer. Of course, some errors may be due to transfer, also called cross-linguistic influence. Transfer means using sounds, expressions, or structures from the L1 when performing in the L2. For example, in the Spanish, a Spanish speaker who produces take it from the side inferior may be trying to use the Spanish adjective inferior equal to lower in English and placing it after the noun as is typical in Spanish constructions. Transfer. If the L1 and L2 have similar features, example marking plurals on the end of nouns, then the learner may be able to benefit from the positive transfer of L1 knowledge to the L2. On the other hand, transferring an L1 feature that is really different from the L2, putting the adjective after the noun, results in negative transfer and may make L2 expression difficult to understand. We should remember that negative transfer, sometimes called interference, is more common in the early stages of L2 learning and often decreases as the learner develops familiarity with the L2. Inner language. On the close inspection, the language produced by L2 learners contains a large number of errors that seem to have no connection to the forms of either the L1 or L2. This system is called an inner language, and it is how considered to be based on the L2 production. Look at the examples in the chart. We have, right, language errors and type of errors. Developmental errors, the error that might very well be made by children acquire the L1. For example, using a verb with no conjugation, a cowboy go. Overgeneralization, the errors that are caused by trying to use a rule in a context where it does not belong. Example, they place toys in the bar, or they buy a dress. Using the third person using the third person singular when it's third person plural, or using the ed when the verb is irregular. Simplification errors, the errors that are caused by simplifying or leaving out some elements. Example, all verbs have the same form regardless of person, number, or tense. Misuse of formulaic expressions. Santa Claus ride a one-horse open sleigh to send a present to the children. So, misuse of formulaic expression. Interference error. On the back of his body has pickpocket. He has a shirt below. So, these are some examples of inner language, right? Errors. For example, inner language. Continue with inner language. For example, the Spanish L1 speaker who says in English, "She name is Maria," is producing a form that is not used by adult speakers of English. Does not occur in English L1 acquisition by children, and is not based on structure in Spanish. Evidence of this sort suggests that there is some in-between system used in the L2 acquisition process that certainly contains aspects of the L1 and L2, but which is an inherently variable system with rules of its own. Motivation. There are several factors that combine in the profile of a successful L2 learner. Obviously, the motivation to learn is important. Many learners have an instrumental motivation. That is, they want to learn the L2 in order to achieve some other goal, such as completing a school graduation requirement or being able to read scientific publications, but not really for any social purposes. In contrast, those learners with an integrative motivation want to learn L2 for social purposes, in order to take part of the social life of a community using the language and to become an accepted member of the community. It is also worth noting that those who experience some success in L2 communication are among the most motivated to learn. Input and output. The term input is used in L1 acquisition to describe the language that the learner is exposed to be beneficial for a L2 learning. But input has to be comprehensible because we can process what we don't understand. Input can be made comprehensible by being simpler in structure and vocabulary and in the variety of speech called for inner talk. Native speakers of English may try to ask an international student, "How are you getting on your studies?" But if not understood, may switch to English class. Do you like it? This type of foreigner talk. Communicative competence. Communicative competence can be defined as the general ability to use language accurately, appropriately and flexibly. The first component is grammatical competence, which involves the accurate use of words and structures. Concentration on grammatical competence only, however, will not provide the learner with the ability to interpret or produce L2 expressions appropriately. The ability to use appropriate language is the second component called social linguistic competence. It enables the learner to know when to say, "Can I have some water?" versus "Give me some water," according to the social context. Much of what was discussed in terms of pragmatics has to become familiar in the cultural context of the L2 if the learner is to develop social linguistic competence. The third component is called strategic competence. This is the ability to organize a message effectively and to compensate via strategies for any difficulties. In L2 use, learners inevitably experience moments when there is a gap between communicative intent and their ability to express that intent. Some learners may just start talking bad idea, whereas others will try to express themselves using a communication strategy, good idea. For example, a Dutch L1 learner wanted to refer to het algeveinder in English, but didn't know the English word, so she used a communication strategy. She created a way of referring to the object by using vocabulary she already knew, saying the things that horses wear under their feet, the iron things, and the listener understood immediately what she meant. Horse shoes. This flexibility in L2 use is a key element in communicative success. In sense, strategic competence is the ability to overcome potential communication problems and interaction. Okay, these are the additional resources for this material. I hope you have understood this, and thank you very much for listening.